Thank you, Ted, for that presentation. I really appreciate it. It kind of goes right directly into what I'd like to talk with us about today, which is, and I've titled this presentation, Independents Strike Back, just because I'm kind of a Star Wars nerd, so. But we strike back with the top two open primary. Though if we blow up the Death Star, that would be fun too, I guess. You know, in putting together this presentation, I was really thinking, you know, where do we start from? So, as folks know, you know, I'm the director of Independent Voice in California. We had a long history to get to the open primary. But I was really thinking, do you start with the chronology and everything that we've done already, or do you start with the demographics like Ted was talking about, the seismic shift towards independence in this country? And I really felt like that's where we had to start. We had to start with the independent voters, because that's what's moving things forward right now. But really, who are independent voters? I mean, I think there's so many different definitions. You know, the media, the talking heads on TV have theirs. And I'd like to go through a couple of those with you, just maybe for laughs, but also because it's a very real way in which the folks attempt to marginalize who independent voters are. So, you know, probably my first experience with one of these things is right after the Ross Perot campaign, because that's initially when I got involved politically as an independent in 1992. I know people say, you don't look that old. Well, I'm getting there. But, but the first thing that a lot of the media and the pundits said, well, this is just a bunch of angry old white men. So, you know, I mean, this was essentially their image of independent voters. And you can see why they would like to put that image out, because essentially it's a very marginal image. It excludes women, it excludes young people, it excludes African Americans, Latinos, it excludes a large swath of the country. Then of course, you know, as we got into the 2000s and they realized that independents really weren't going away, they said, well, those independents, who are they? You know, they can't figure out their left, they can't figure out their right, they don't know where they're at on issues, they're just squishy, you know. That's another term they use for us, squishies. Consultants like that all the time. So, you know, independents, we just can't figure out how to pick a party without their guidance. We just don't know what to do. Now, then you'll get into attacks, and this often comes, I think, more from the liberal left wing of the Democratic Party, which is that independents are just uneducated and apathetic. And the underlying thought process there is we shouldn't allow people to vote who don't, quote unquote, deserve the right because they haven't educated themselves and they're not very smart. And, oh, maybe mostly because I'm afraid they won't vote the way I want them to vote. You know, and this is kind of the image that they give us of who independent voters are, right? I don't know, maybe I'll get up today, maybe I'll just kind of sit on the couch and watch some more, you know, Oprah and such. Nothing against Oprah, actually, like Oprah. And finally, and this is the most recent incarnation of how people portray, in the media and particularly pundits portray independent voters. And there's a guy by the name of Roy, and I never pronounce his last name right, it's Tuxiera, who is he's a Democratic Party consultant who works at a think tank, will run around all day and say, well, if you look at independents, you know, they always vote for the same candidates based on where they are ideologically. You know, well, of course, you know, I mean, you only offer us a choice that's that big. So if I'm a little bit more to the left, I'm going to vote for the candidate a little bit more to the left. But they want to take that to say, okay, well, independents, they don't really exist. You're a myth. I always think to myself, geez, I thought I was here. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I am a figment of my own imagination. But, you know, they would ultimately like to think of us like this, right? We're Sasquatch. We're the Bigfoot. You know, we're the only people who actually believe in us are kind of crazy, and then maybe they live in a trailer and they chase us around or something like that. But really, I mean, who are independent voters? Thankfully, there are actually organizations out there who, now, this might sound radical, they actually speak to independent voters about who they are, rather than simply drawing conclusions based on who they would like independent voters to be. And one of those organizations in California is called the Public Policy Institute of California. and it's chaired by Mark Baldassare, as somebody who I've had several conversations with about independent voters. So just taking from their numbers, if you look at independents on an ideological spectrum, because again, there's always this assumption that Democrats are on the left, Republicans are on the right, therefore, independents, the only place they can be is in the middle. That's actually not the case. That's one of those myths I want to explode today. So if you look at it, I mean, you can read the figures as well as I can, unless you didn't bring your glasses like I did. But, you know, it's about a third on the left, it's about a third on the right, and it's about a third in the middle. So if you see who independents are, we're actually all across the ideological spectrum. Well, that's interesting. So there isn't necessarily an ideological link to who independents are. Maybe that's not part of the definition of who an independent is. Well, what about racial and ethnic makeup? Well, it turns out there's this place in California they call Stanford University. You might have heard of it once in a while. They actually did this thing called a study where they go out and they actually talk to independents and they find out about who they really are. Well, they found that more than 40% of the independent voters in California, they're not white. And in fact, Latinos are the fastest growing segment of independent voters. And again, this is specific to California. Demographics nationally, though, I think are not too far away from this. They also found that independents don't have common views on many of these ideological issues. There are some outliers. Independents, 66% of them are more pro-environment. You know, they tend to coalesce on a couple of other key issues in those 60 percentile, but really you can't draw a straight line. You can't draw a straight line through education, immigration, tax policy, and come out with these are who the independent voters are. So then, really, what does it mean to be an independent voter? Our core set of beliefs, and I know this, and I know you folks know this from doing years and years of speaking with independent voters on the phone. You know, we started in 2002 doing telephone polls of independent voters to locate folks, find out who they are, and tell them what they're doing, tell them what we're doing, excuse me, and get them involved. And over that time, we found that independents ultimately feel like government should be about what's best for the people, not the political parties. And of course, independents aren't stupid. We recognize, like everybody else I think in the country does now, that that's not the way it really works. That every conversation that gets had, not just at the State House or in Washington, but on the television news, in the newspaper, everywhere, is dominated by, well, is this going to be best for the Democratic Party or is this going to benefit the Republican Party? And that literally, that's the baseline for anything to get done. Can the parties win? What about the American people? That's really where independent voters are at. And we recognize, and you know, look, I don't have to tell you, number one, independent voters distrust parties. 71% said they'd never even join one, even if they had the perfect party tailored for them. I think these are important statements. And 81% feel that government is run by a few big special interests. And two of those special interests are the Democratic and the Republican parties, of course. So maybe being an independent has nothing to do with a stance on the quote-unquote issues that get bantered about. Maybe it's a stance on the fundamentals of how a democracy should work. So that ultimately, and the bottom line here, is that independents, we want to take power from the political parties and we want to turn it over to the people. We want to turn it over to the voters. Oh yes, one more thing unifies independents. In many states, like California before 2012, which is the first year we used the open primary, the top two nonpartisan primary, I should say, independents pay taxes to fund private elections that we can't even vote in. And Chad Peace is going to say a little bit more about that with end partisanship later today. So that brings me to the top two nonpartisan primary. Now, I briefly wanted to go over with folks, well, what is the top two nonpartisan primary? Because I think a lot of times, particularly in California, if you pick up the Secretary of State's handbook and you read about it, I mean, it seems like rocket science, right? It seems like you need some kind of advanced degree to understand the concept. In fact, when I read the Secretary of State's description of the process in 2012, now I helped pass this in 2010, and I've fought for it since 2004. I didn't understand it. And if I didn't understand it, do you think anybody else who read that thing understood it? But ultimately, it's a very simple concept. Everybody, candidates, voters, everybody participates without regard to party. And the top two finishers, they go on to a runoff style election. That's it. You vote for who you want, and the top two go on to a runoff style election. So ultimately, the power does not go through political parties, it goes straight to the voters. I have my nice little graphic. So why do we, the independent voters, why do we like, and in particular the independent movement, why do we like the top two nonpartisan primary? Well, for starters, and I think this is the important part of it, because what's good for the candidates and the whole candidate system often gets put forward when you talk about top two, but for us, from our perspective, number one, all voters, including independents, have real power. Before we passed top two in California, 3.8 million voters, tax-paying citizens who registered to vote outside of the Democrat, Republican, or even one of the third parties could not really participate in this process unless the parties agreed to it. Don't think that's the way it's supposed to work. Some other great benefits of it are the candidates have to speak to all the voters, not just a tiny segment of partisans in order to get elected. And that is a fundamental game changer. And in one-party districts, and I know most districts are headed towards this now, and the general election actually matters. So in a Republican district, where a Republican is always going to win, as opposed, instead of going to the fall, where you're going to have a Republican who's going to win even if the guy murdered his wife, versus the second coming of Mother Teresa as a Democrat who couldn't win, if she paid everybody off. This actually gives us a real choice. In that Republican district, you're likely to see two Republicans have to slug it out, not just for the narrow segment of Republicans, but for all the voters. You might even see an independent in that district, independent versus Republican. It opens up a whole new realm of possibilities. And I don't know, my wife was drinking a glass of wine when I wrote this, so I said it pairs really well with redistricting reform. Okay, so there are a couple things I want to talk about that the top two nonpartisan primary is not. And Ted actually gave me a couple more of these. So the first one that I really want us to shy away from is it's not a way to elect moderates. Again, let's think about who independent voters are. So there's that broken image of the Democrats on the left, the Republicans on the right, independents therefore must be in the middle. We know that's not the case. So I don't think we really want to elect moderates as much as we want to elect people who support the right of the people to govern themselves, right? To take power away from the political parties. And oftentimes, this gets put forward by moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats because the argument polls well. And with all due respect to our friends, Schwarzenegger's folks and Abel Maldonado and others who worked with us very closely to pass the top two nonpartisan primary in California, their consultants would always tell me, "Oh, this argument polls really well, Jason." I said, "It might poll really well, but it's not going to bring anybody out to the polls because ultimately nobody cares about this. But they care about the parties versus the people." The other two arguments that I think, and then I'll move on from this, is that it drives up participation. That's not necessarily the case, and that's not necessarily the aim of it. People still have to go out and participate in the system themselves. And I think there's some other ways to address participation. Ted, what's the last one I'm missing? Participation, moderates. It'll come to us later. And the thing these arguments to me, again, I had to get my Star Wars nerd thing in there somewhere. These arguments are a trap. They're a trap, and I've learned this the hard way. I got bruised in debates myself over this thing on the radio, etc. These arguments are a total trap. So how did California get to top two? And I know Ted said, it started with the Grange, but there was I would like to think that we did start this movement. It had a little bit of a hand in how that happened, because in California it actually took 2 times on the ballot to pass it. Now, The first time was 2004, and it was Prop 62, and it used many of the arguments that I just said top 2 is not about, and we lost. In fact, we didn't just lose, we got creamed. We got our butts kicked. And on election night, I drank a whole lot.
There's a good picture.
Yeah, you know, if there was a picture out there, I want it. I've paid to suppress all the pictures of that. But let's just say I was hanging out in a bar at Pacini and Panetti's, right down there next to the cable car turnaround on Market Street in San Francisco, and I don't remember how many vodka tonics I had, but it was a lot. As we watched this thing get absolutely crushed. Get absolutely crushed. I may have even cried just a little bit. Maybe. Okay, I cried a lot. So. Then, in 2010, after we thought, oh, we'll never be able to, I mean, what idiot would put money into getting another top 2 open primary measure on the ballot after we'd gotten crushed in 2004, right? I mean, how would that ever come about? California, 36 million people. It takes, you know, 10, 12 million to get something on the ballot. Then you need another 10 million to run a campaign for it. I thought if this was going to come about anyway, it was going to be a small state somewhere where somebody could invest $500,000 and do something like this. But thankfully to my buddy Abel Maldonado, he describes this differently, but among friends here, I'll describe this as he held him hostage over the budget and said, look, you want the budget passed, you need one Republican vote? I'll give you my vote, but you're going to put the top 2 open primary on the ballot. It was one of the most, I think, audacious political moves in the last century, quite honestly. And, you know, despite the fact that he's gone on to do other things, I know his heart is in this, and I think he'll always be remembered for this. We won by a good margin in 2010. And despite the fact we won, I drank a lot.
But you did.
I hope you're not seeing a pattern. I actually don't. The funny thing is that I don't drink at all. So I don't. You can ask my wife. She's always asking me to have a glass of wine with her. But the reason is I still, to this day, cannot believe that we passed the thing. I'm shocked. I wake up every morning thinking, oh, that's right, we passed top 2 nonpartisan primary in California. Oh, okay, you know, just got to pinch myself. So I wanted to briefly go over with you some of the impacts of doing that. And this has kind of helped, this is a little bit of therapy for me to help me fully realize that we did in fact pass it. So we used it for the first time in 2012. We also did a citizens redistricting at the same time. And there were some pretty dramatic results. 14 incumbents were gone. That's a record for the modern era. Okay, 6 of them just gave up. They just threw in the towel beforehand. We're talking about people who have been in Congress for 20 plus years. They just threw the towel in rather than face a new system. 8 of them were defeated at the ballot box. And most of those folks who were defeated at the ballot box were defeated in those same party races I talked about, where it was a Democrat versus a Democrat in the final round, or a Republican versus a Republican. Just to let you know what the comparison there is, only 1 incumbent lost in all the races in California between 2002 and 2010. 1. His name was Richard Pombo, and he was one of the Republicans caught in the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal in 2006, and he still almost won. Some of the notable folks who went down to defeat in California, thanks to top 2, were 20-term Congressman Pete Stark, who was defeated again by a fellow Democrat, Eric Swalwell. I was going to queue up something from Pete, but he is kind of a vile guy, so I decided this is probably not the right and appropriate venue for that. The other one is that party outsider Mark Levine, and we actually ended up, just fair disclosure, endorsing Mark Levine to help demonstrate what the power of independence could be if we organize it to use the top 2. He defeated party insider Michael Allen. They were both Democrats for the assembly seat. And the notable thing about this race is that because Mark Levine reached out to Republicans and he reached out to independents in the second phase of the thing, the Michael Allen people, the Sacramento insiders, tried to run a smear campaign against him. Mark Levine is not a real Democrat. That was the whole battle cry of their campaign. And they spent millions of dollars on mailers saying he's a Republican, et cetera, et cetera. But lo and behold, Mark Levine carried the day. Some other impacts in California, Democrats got the supermajority, but if you look at the track record of the legislature in that time, top two kept them honest. And we passed an on-time budget for the first time in recent memory. You know, minor details, right? So, and in 2014, many of the candidates are looking at campaigns differently. They're reaching out to all the voters because it's now a necessity. There are some challenges ahead for California. It's something that we're addressing. Only 25% of independents know they can vote in the primary in 2012. We did try and work with the Secretary of State on this issue. They told us to take a hike because Deborah Bowen is not a supporter of top two. Thankfully, she's termed out, so we will hopefully get a supporter of top two in the Secretary of State's job. So we said, okay, screw you then. You know, we're going to go talk to all the county registrars of voters up and down the state. And in fact, LA, Orange County, San Diego, I could name a whole number of counties. We actually worked with them to revise all their election materials to let independent voters know that they could in fact vote in the primary. Our goal here is, instead of it taking 4 or 5 election cycles for voters to catch up, could we cut that down to 2 or 3 election cycles? And in particular, could we cut it down, you know, ahead of 2016? The challenges ahead nationally for us, I think, are how do we use the California experience to start kicking some butt everywhere else? How do we take this, how do we roll this out to other states? We had a lot of elements come together at the right time. I hesitate to use the term perfect storm because it wasn't that perfect. But I think that the question is, can we duplicate that? Personally, I think the answer is yes, if we prepare. And honestly, that's why we're here today. So just some parting inspiration, because I just read the fantastic book on Lincoln called Team of Rivals. Lincoln's one of my favorite presidents, but I think about why we do what we do in these kinds of terms. So government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that's really what we're here to do today. I mean, I believe that we are fighting just as hard as those folks did at Gettysburg, etc. I mean, we are facing which otherwise seem to be impossible odds, and yet we're winning. So I wanted to leave us with that today, and also open this up for some discussion on our movements, who are independent voters, and where do we go next.